This is our research project about time spent with media and racial biases. The researchers for this project were Lauren Harkins, Lexi Brown, and Meredith DeCoste.
Okay, social media is a major part of our lives. It consumes most of our time, which leaves us vulnerable to being exposed to biases within the media through negative stereotypes. News sources can reinforce stereotypes of people of color because they show unequal amounts of stories that criminalize people of color versus white people. People resort to these stereotypes because they are so readily available to common news sources and media. The amount of time someone spends engaging with media sources will have an effect on participants' implicit racial biases due to the negative overrepresentation of Black Americans. The news sources include Fox, CNN, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, and Apple News. There were 38 participants that were Westfield State University students aged 18 through 24 of a variety of racial and gender identities. The participants completed a multi-part survey, completing a consent form. The first part of the survey included demographic questions, including age, gender, race, education, and more. The next part included questions about media consumption, news platforms, and time spent on various sources. Finally, the participants were instructed to take the implicit association test on race. The test includes questions such as, do you have warm or cold feelings towards Black and white people? Then the participants were shown pictures of people's faces as well as different descriptive words and had to assign the faces and words to either the European American or African American category. These questions were used to help determine the participants' racial biases based on a scale with the lowest score being strong preference to European American over African Americans. The higher score to strong preference to African Americans over European Americans. A linear regression was run to see where they may have been significant correlations between variables. Correlations were then run between IAT scores and three other variables: news source, time spent on news source, and age, because they related to the hypothesis, and that is where significance was found.
For all the graphs, the IAT scores were coded, with 1 being strong preference for European Americans compared to African Americans, 2, moderate preference for European Americans, 3, slight preference for European Americans, 4, little to no preference of European Americans and African Americans, 5, slight preference for African Americans, 6, moderate preference for African American, and finally 7 being strong preference for African American compared to European American. The first graph shows the y-axis being the IAT score based on the scale of the 1 to 7, and the x-axis being time spent on media sources in minutes. The slope of the line shows the positive correlation between IAT score and time spent on news sources, meaning that as IAT scores increase, the time spent on media also increased. Although there is a positive correlation, there was no significance of the correlation for this set of data. For our second graph, the news sources included Facebook, CNN, Twitter, Fox, Instagram, and Snapchat. They were coded in Twitter and CNN being 1 and 2 as they show more liberal views, and Fox and Facebook were 6 and 7 as they show more conservative views, with other media mixed in the middle. The IAT coding was the same as before, and the y-axis is the IAT scores again. The x-axis shows news sources. The slope of the lines shows a positive correlation, meaning that as news sources got more conservative, people's implicit biases scores rose also. There's no significance to this data set, though. For our final graph, we looked at age and IET score. The y-axis was the participant's IET score again, while the x-axis was the participant's age. The slope of the line shows a negative correlation with significance, meaning that as people get older, they start to have a higher preference for European Americans compared to African Americans, which matched previous research in this field. We believe this happens due to the fact that as we age, we are more aware of what is happening in the world and get set in our biases that our friends, family, and media have shown us.
Results of the study show no significant relationship between different media sources participants reported using and their reported IET scores, and no significant relationship between time spent engaging with media and participants' IET scores. A significant positive relationship was found between participants' age and their reported IET scores, meaning that the older the participant, the higher the level of implicit bias towards Black people. The finding of the relationship between the IET scores was not surprising, as other studies have reported similar findings of positive correlations between age and attitudes about race. A study done in Australia shows that older people had higher levels of intolerance of minorities, especially towards Muslims and Indigenous people. One of the limitations of this study was the lack of diversity among participants. Every participant was a college-educated student between the ages of 18 and 24. The lack of educational diversity in the study may have had an effect on the results, because research indicates that people who receive more education show less intolerance for people of color than those who have received less education. If this study were to be conducted again, future researchers should ensure that participants come from all different racial, ethnic, and educational backgrounds, as well as include a large number of participants of different ages. We would like to thank all the participants for providing us with the data that allowed us to study this topic. We would also like to thank Professor Manella, Professor Simbrowski, Professor Hugh Zhang, and Professor Hafner for emailing their students for participating in the study.